Isaac was born from a divine promise, the son of Abraham and Sarah, a couple who, at an advanced age, had lost all hope of having children. But God had promised them that through this son, a great nation would emerge, changing the destiny of humanity. Throughout his life, Isaac faced trials, saw his family divided, and learned that trusting God means giving up control, but never faith. Let's learn the story of this man who discovered that true strength comes from peace and that God's promises, although mysterious, never fail. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. If you like the content, don't forget to send a thanks a lot. And if you want to support the channel even more, become a member and gain access to exclusive benefits. Abraham was sitting in front of his tent when he heard the unexpected. God himself assured him that even at 100 years old, he would have a son. Sarah, his wife, already hopeless and 90 years old, laughed when she heard that promise. It was no surprise. Advanced age had dried up his strength, and the years of waiting without results had hardened his heart. Abraham, on the other hand, kept within himself a faith that no one understood, a silent certainty that grew every day. He looked up at the starry sky, remembering the divine pact that his descendants would be as numerous as those lights that hovered over the desert. Then, after a long time, when the promise already seemed like a legend, it happened. The news that Sarah was expecting a child swept through the camp like a surprising wind. With each passing day, her belly grew, and with it, the anxiety and reverence of the entire house. Abraham saw his wife change, smile in a way he never imagined seeing again. And finally, the moment has come. At birth, the child was given the name Isaac, which means laughter, a name loaded with meaning, as he was the joy that God planted among them. Isaac grew up surrounded by care and protected by a special feeling, a purpose that no one could explain exactly, but that everyone felt. Each day, Abraham looked at the boy and realized the weight of responsibility that promise carried. It was as if Isaac was more than a son. He was a living sign of God's faithfulness. Since he was little, Isaac felt the weight of a promise that hung over him, even though he didn't really understand what it meant. His father Abraham often told him about the covenant with God, about the stars in the sky that one day would symbolize their descendants. Isaac listened attentively, impressed, but still far from understanding what all this would require of him. In that home marked by faith, Isaac grew up alongside Sarah, his mother, and his half-brother Ishmael. However, things began to change when Sarah, upon realizing the rivalry between Isaac and Ishmael, felt the need to protect her son. She feared that the chosen boy could be affected by living with Ishmael, and over time convinced Abraham to remove Hagar and her brother. Isaac saw, with sadness, Ishmael's departure. It was the first sign that his path would be different. It was a lonely, unusual path, marked by invisible responsibilities, but which he could already feel. After Ishmael's departure, life went on, and Isaac once again became the focus of Sarah and Abraham's care. Abraham watched him as if there was a constant expectation in the air, something only he and Sarah knew, but never said out loud. Isaac, in turn, grew increasingly curious about the special purpose that everyone seemed to see in him. Little did he know that his faith and courage would be tested in ways no son could imagine. The sky was beginning to lighten when Abraham called Isaac for a long trip to Mount Moriah. For the young man, the journey seemed ordinary. He had already accompanied his father in sacrifices and rituals, moments when Abraham raised altars and offered animals to God. But that morning, the father's face was heavier, as if he were keeping a secret that he couldn't share. With an axe in his hand and the wood for the altar on his shoulders, Isaac walked alongside Abraham. With each step, the silence between them grew thicker. The two were already far from home when Isaac looked around and realized that something essential for the ritual was missing: the animal for sacrifice. He hesitated before asking his father, but driven by curiosity and the strangeness of the situation, he finally asked, "Father, where is the sacrificial lamb?" Abraham, with a distant look, responded enigmatically, "God will provide the lamb, my son." Isaac, still not understanding, nodded, trusting his father's words, even though a strange restlessness began to fill his heart. When they finally reached the top of the mountain, Abraham prepared the altar, arranged the wood, and with a voice that could barely be sustained, called Isaac to tie him to the wood. Confused and scared, Isaac obeyed, perhaps out of love and respect, perhaps out of an inexplicable trust he felt in Abraham. When he saw the shine of the blade in his father's hands, Isaac closed his eyes and felt the anguish that coursed through Abraham's soul. But before the blade reached him, a voice echoed across the mountain calling Abraham. The suspended blade stopped in the air, and Abraham took a deep breath, feeling relief flood his chest. The divine voice had called him, interrupting the sacrifice. Still trembling, Abraham heard God's words stating that his faith had been proven and that he would not need to sacrifice his own son. Isaac, still lying on the altar, opened his eyes, confused, and saw his father in tears, untying the ropes with trembling hands. The two looked at each other, and at that moment, Isaac realized that his life didn't just belong to him. There was something greater, a purpose he didn't yet understand. They came down from the mountain together, but the silence between them was different now. Isaac felt a mixture of respect, fear, and admiration for his father, who was willing to do the unthinkable in the name of his faith. And although the questions echoed in his mind, he kept them to himself, accepting that, for now, some answers would remain a mystery. But Isaac's life soon changed again. Sometime later, Sarah, his mother, fell ill, and her health began to slowly decline. Isaac, with his deep eyes, watched her in silence, every day more aware that her time was running out. He remembered the moments with Sarah, the stories she told, and the protective love with which she surrounded him. The day she passed, his mother's absence left a void that Isaac didn't know how to fill. Now, with adulthood weighing on him and the mission of continuing Abraham's lineage, Isaac tried to deal with grief and growing responsibilities. The mourning for his mother was still fresh when Isaac found himself facing a new reality. His father, already advanced in age, began to talk about the importance of finding a wife for him. Isaac, still shaken by the loss, did not think about marriage. But Abraham knew that God's promise could not be fulfilled without Isaac continuing the lineage. With determination, Abraham called his trusted servant and sent him on a special mission. He should seek, in distant lands, a wife for the son of promise. Isaac watched the servant leave, not knowing what to expect. Days passed, and he continued his tasks, but his heart was restless. He knew something important was about to happen. One afternoon, while walking through the fields at dusk, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. It was as if, when he looked at the horizon, he could see beyond what his eyes could see, reached. There, alone with his thoughts, he realized the weight of his responsibility, of God's promise that was upon his life. It was then that in the distance he saw a caravan approaching. Isaac's heart accelerated without him understanding why. As the caravan approached, he could see a young woman with a covered face, riding a camel, watching him curiously. She came down, and he noticed her eyes shining, reflecting a mix of nervousness and charm. It was Rebecca, the woman chosen to be his companion. Without exchanging many words, they both felt that something special connected them. There was a lightness in her presence that brought comfort to Isaac's heart, a warmth he hadn't experienced since the loss of Sarah. Rebecca was unlike anything he had ever known, courageous, kind, and willing to embark on the same journey of faith that he had inherited from Abraham. Their union was sealed quickly, as if they both knew that this meeting was not the result of chance. With Rebecca by his side, Isaac began to see that his path still held profound challenges, but now he was not facing them, would face alone. The years with Rebecca brought joy and stability to Isaac. He found in her a friend, a counselor, and a woman of faith. They shared tasks, dreams, and small, everyday moments, always aware of the greater calling that united them. But as time passed, a silence began to grow between them. The days and nights stretched on, and Rebekah was unable to get pregnant. With each new year that passed without a child, their worry increased. Isaac felt the weight of his legacy becoming stronger. He knew he was the heir to a great promise, but how could that promise be fulfilled if he didn't have children to carry it on? As anxiety became a shadow in his home, Isaac turned to God, spending hours in prayer, asking for a miracle. He sought answers and strength, remembering the sacrifice on Mount Moriah and how God had been faithful at every moment of his life. Rebekah, although frustrated, shared the same faith and hope. Deep down, she knew that the desire for a child was not just hers, but that of an entire people who would one day emerge from that family. And then, when the weight seemed unbearable, the news finally arrived. Rebekah was pregnant, but this pregnancy would not be common. Soon, Rebekah noticed something strange inside herself. There was a constant struggle in her womb, as if children were fighting for space and strength before they were even born. Intrigued, Rebekah prayed, trying to understand what was happening. It was then that God revealed to her that two people lived in her womb, and that the older would serve the younger. This message brought a mixture of relief and apprehension, as she knew it would alter the family's course forever. With his heart divided between the mystery and the promise, Isaac awaited the birth of his children, without imagining the conflicts that were to come and how his own faith would be tested again. When the twins were finally born, Isaac and Rebekah realized how different their children were from the first moment. Esau came first, covered in hair, strong and impetuous, while Jacob, more serene, was born holding his brother's heel, as if already demonstrating his cunning. Over the years, the boys' personalities only accentuated these differences. Esau grew up free and wild. He was a hunter and spent long hours in the fields, far from home. Jacob, on the other hand, preferred to stay close to home, more reserved and careful, watching and learning from Rebekah. This division, however, created a delicate dynamic in the family. Isaac had a special affection for Esau, admiring his son's strength and courage, seeing in him an extension of his own youth. Rebekah, in turn, became fond of Jacob, who shared her tranquility and intelligence. This difference in parental affection sowed a subtle rivalry between the brothers, something that Isaac seemed to ignore, perhaps because he believed that God's choices did not depend on these internal disputes. As they grew up, Esau and Jacob not only competed, but also cultivated resentment that they both disguised, each in their own way. On one of these days, Esau returned exhausted from a hunt and found Jacob preparing a steaming, fragrant stew. Fatigue and hunger dominated Esau, who, without thinking twice, asked his brother for some food. Jacob, taking advantage of the situation, made an unexpected proposal. He would give the stew, but in exchange, Esau would have to give up his birthright. Esau, driven by haste and impulse, accepted, exchanging his inheritance for a dish of lentils. When Isaac found out about the exchange, he didn't give much importance to the agreement, considering it just a prank between brothers. He still saw Esau as the legitimate heir, without imagining that that thoughtless exchange would make room for something much bigger, and that his family's destiny would take an unexpected turn. As the years passed, the agreement between Esau and Jacob seemed like a distant memory, a game between brothers. However, for Jacob, this was more than a simple exchange. It was a silent promise that one day he would inherit God's blessing and favor, regardless of whether he was the youngest son. And although Isaac did not take what had happened seriously, he was approaching old age and knew that he would soon have to pass on the birthright blessing. Isaac, now with weak eyes and almost unable to see, decided it was time to bless Esau. He called his son and asked him to go to the fields and bring some game so that he could eat, and then grant him the blessing of the inheritance. Esau, honored and excited, left immediately, not knowing that Rebekah, who was listening to the conversation, was already planning to interfere. She did not forget what God had revealed to her during her pregnancy, that the oldest would serve the youngest. Rebekah was quick. He called Jacob and told him about his father's plan. He instructed him to disguise himself as Esau, placing goatskins on his arms to imitate his brother's fur, and wearing his clothes so that Isaac would smell Esau's distinctive scent. Jacob, initially hesitant, followed his mother's instructions. They prepared a delicious dish, and Jacob entered Isaac's tent, saying in a firm voice, "Father, here I am Esau." Isaac, confused by Jacob's familiar voice, touched his son's arms and felt the roughness of the skin. Convinced that it was Esau, he offered him the plate of food, and after eating, he extended his hands over Jacob, granting him the blessing that would guarantee him leadership and the continuity of God's promise. However, when Esau entered Isaac's tent, his exhausted hunting face had not yet cooled. With a proud expression, he presented the dish he had prepared to his father, certain that the birthright blessing would soon be his. But when he heard Esau's voice, Isaac trembled. Confused, it took him a moment to understand that something terrible had happened. "But who are you?" he asked, his voice weak and scared. Esau, without understanding his father's reaction, replied, "It is I, Esau, your firstborn." Isaac, shaken, realized his mistake. The blessing, which could not be revoked, had been given to Jacob. Esau, upon realizing that his brother had deceived him, cried out in anger and pain, begging his father for a blessing as well. Isaac, devastated, murmured words of comfort, but he could not undo what he had already done. "Your brother came and deceived me," he said, with a tone of sadness the likes of which Esau had never heard. Jacob stole the blessing. From that day on, Esau's hatred for Jacob turned into a promise of revenge. Isaac's tranquility was broken. He saw, with a heavy heart, how the bonds between his children became undone, and feared that this hatred would lead to irreversible tragedies. It was then that Rebekah, aware of the approaching danger, called Jacob in secret and advised him to flee to the land of her uncle Laban until Esau's anger calmed down. Before leaving, Jacob went to Isaac, who, despite everything, blessed him again, recognizing that God had a special purpose for him. The father looked at his son with a mixture of sadness and hope, understanding that Jacob's path would be lonely and full of trials. Upon seeing Jacob leave, Isaac felt the weight of farewell and a silent pain that squeezed his chest. With Jacob's departure, Isaac's tent became emptier, and he spent long days in silence, contemplating the choices and mysteries that surrounded his family. All that was left to him now, in his old age, was to face loneliness and the consequences of a blessing that had forever transformed the destiny of his children. With Jacob exiled and Esau immersed in sorrow, Isaac decided to leave the environment of his tent in search of new air. So he moved with his family to Gerar, a land inhabited by the Philistines. The change was not just a matter of geography. Isaac tried to find peace in a place where he didn't have to relive, day after day, the conflicts between his children. In Gerar, life seemed promising, but Isaac soon faced difficulties. The land was dry, and finding water became a constant challenge. In search of sustenance, he began to dig up the wells that his father, Abraham, had dug long ago, wells that the Philistines had closed out of envy. Each well he reopened was a victory, a step forward in keeping his family and servants safe and supplied. But whenever he got water, the Philistine shepherds came to claim the well, saying the land and water belonged to them. Isaac, with his patience and peaceful temperament, did not seek conflict. Whenever he was forced to abandon a well, he would leave and dig another, remaining firm in his decision to avoid fights. This cycle of digging wells and abandoning them seemed endless. But Isaac continued to persevere, believing that at some point he would find a safe place where his family could prosper without disputes. Finally, after digging another well in a more distant valley, Isaac found peace. The Philistines did not follow him this time, and he named the well Rehoboth, which meant wide place, as he felt that God had finally given him and his family a space where they could live in tranquility. It was a small triumph, but a triumph that brought him relief. It was then that, with the news of his prosperity, Abimelech, the king of the Philistines himself, came to meet him. Before King Abimelech, Isaac remained calm, although the peace proposal surprised him. Abimelech, who had previously watched Isaac's silent battles for the wells with indifference, now saw something else. "We have seen that God is with you in everything you do," said the king, with genuine respect. Isaac listened carefully to Abimelech's words, and silent relief took over his heart. He realized that his journey in Gerar, marked by patience and persistence, had won not only the land, but also the respect of his former rivals. Isaac accepted the peace offering, and they sealed the alliance with a meal, sitting side by side as friends. As they talked, Isaac felt that this truce represented more than an agreement. It was a sign of God's blessing on his life, even after all the conflicts. The table of peace they shared symbolized the long-awaited rest, and Isaac understood that his silent fidelity had been his greatest victory. After the banquet, Abimelech took his leave, leaving behind a promise of lasting peace. That same night, Isaac's servants arrived with news. They had dug a new well, and this time they found plenty of water. It was as if the sky had opened a path for him, pouring out upon the dry land the reward for his perseverance. Isaac called the well Self, which means oath, as a reminder of the covenant with Abimelech and God's provision in a time of need. From that moment on, Isaac experienced a phase of stability and growth. But even in the midst of this prosperity, he could not help but think of his distant children, of the wounds still open between Esau and Jacob. In the last years of his life, Isaac watched the large tent that sheltered so many generations and felt the weight of time. God's blessing continued to be present in everything he did. The herds grew, the harvests were plentiful, and the servants worked with dedication. But even surrounded by prosperity, he could not avoid the restlessness that welled up whenever he thought about his children. Since Jacob's departure, Isaac's house seemed to have lost something essential. Esau, although present, carried with him a bitterness that could not be erased. He had built his life there, married women from neighboring peoples, but the resentment and anger of the past were still visible in his eyes. Isaac tried to keep peace with him, but he knew that the gulf between the brothers was deep. Isaac often wondered if one day he would see the two together again, as a family, but he could not predict what the future held. Isaac's days were spent in reflection, and he remembered his own youth, the sacrifices made by Abraham, the promises of God on Mount Moriah, the silent love of Sarah, and the unexpected arrival of Rebekah. He saw the continuity of these stories in every detail around him, as if all generations were connected by an invisible thread, sustained by the same faith that guided his steps from the beginning. As his strength waned, Isaac allowed himself to trust that even if he did not witness the reunion between his sons, God's promise would take its course. He believed that just as God had sustained him through each challenge, he would also guide the steps of Jacob and Esau, leading them into the future that had been promised since the days of Abraham. And it was like this, with a calm heart and eyes turned upward, that Isaac rested, leaving as an inheritance the faith that would span generations. His legacy, intertwined in the paths of his children, would last, and the stories of his life would continue to inspire, reminding us that God's promises remain, even in the midst of life's struggles and uncertainties. The story of Isaac teaches us that true courage is not always shown in great deeds or grandiose victories, but in calm persistence, in the willingness to continue, even when the paths seem uncertain. One of Isaac's greatest teachings is the importance of waiting on God. For years, he waited for the blessing of a son with Rebekah, and even when it seemed impossible, he trusted that the promise would be fulfilled. And, along his journey, he encountered difficulties, such as conflicts with the Philistines and the rivalry of his own children, but he always chose peace. Her story reminds us that we don't always have control over the events around us, but we can choose how to react to them. And in the end, he left a legacy based on loyalty, an inheritance that was transmitted to Jacob and through him to an entire nation. Thus, Isaac's life is a powerful reminder that God remains faithful. He not only guides the steps of those who trust in him, but he sustains every promise until the end. Struggles may come, distances may seem insurmountable, but like Isaac, we are called to trust, because what God promises, he always fulfills. If you liked Isaac's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.